All right, we are live here at MythVision Podcast. Dr. John J. Collins is with us. How are you, John?
I am fine, Derek. How are
Oh,
you?
we're gonna have a heck of a show. I can't wait for you to tell us what what your thoughts are on this. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the one and only Dr. John J. Collins, a Bible scholar of unparalleled expertise and wit. He's got a PhD from Harvard, is the Holmes Professor of Old Testament Criticism and Interpretation at Yale Divinity School. And would you still say you still are that, even though you're retired?
I would add emeritus.
That's right. Thank you for correcting me. And an impressive list of publications. I mean, go on Amazon. We'll show that in just a minute. But don't let that fool you. He's not one to shy away from a lively debate or a good pun. Dr. Collins is a master of ancient languages and textual criticism, and he has spent decades delving into the complexities of the Bible. He's here to share his insights and wisdom with us. So buckle up and get ready for an intellectually stimulating and entertaining ride. With that being said, here's our intro. Dr. Collins, what do you think of that intro? It's a trip. It's a trip. Quick plug, and then we'll get into questions because I want to. You're the kind of scholar that I can ask a question, and I could walk away for 45 minutes and come back and be like, "Well, I'm about halfway through explaining this particular thing," because there's so much to learn about all this. He has the book particularly that we're going to be kind of dealing with in this discussion is The Invention of Judaism, Torah and Jewish Identity from Deuteronomy to Paul. And though he's not a Pauline scholar, so to speak, you're in the category with me. And Dr. Collins, I'm sure you kind of have a sixth sense after reading all the different scholars in this field on what makes the most sense of you. And that's kind of what we're going to have you here today to do. I hope people will also support us on the Patreon and consider checking out our courses, our lectures. We now have online courses. A lot of the scholars that go to many of these colleges are now doing recordings. It helps them, and it also helps get this out to a more general audience so the general public can learn some of the stuff that is inside of the ivory towers, as I call it, of scholarship. So, Dr. Collins, again, thank you for joining me. I recently interviewed Jonathan Adler on his book.
Yes, very good.
Yes. So you thumbs up all the way on this work.
Yeah. Yes, I ran into Jonathan Adler at a conference in Sweden in May of 2019, I believe. And then he happened to be coming to Yale on a sabbatical. And so we spent a lot of time together. He wanted to do this book, and I was able to offer him a forum in the Anchor Reference Library. His book is, in a way, complementary to mine.
Exactly.
We don't agree on everything, but we agree on the bulk of it. And but the main difference between the two books is I am talking about texts, he's talking about archaeology.
It's amazing how they merged in his book. Yeah. He actually quotes you and he references you often. And I was quite impressed with how he's not denying that there weren't some small elite priest group or figures at some point in history, but there's like no evidence that the common people ever practiced the things in here. And even further, that anyone practiced anything in these laws that we're seeing, because you talk about this before, and you mentioned I went recently to Palestine and I checked out the Holy Land, and I went down there in Qumran. I saw the pools and and I don't know why, but the one thing I kept walking away with while I had tour guide, Dr. James D. Tabor, was actually showing us this area. And he said, well, these Qumran, sectarian sect, they all had tapeworms. And here they are doing these like baths, I don't know why this is the only thing that really, really sunk into my head, and I kept thinking about it weeks later. They all had tapeworms, and they're passing it around by dipping into the same sanctifying water that is purifying them. They just didn't know about germs. They didn't know that this would. Anyway.
Now, it is possible, that Dr. Tabor had a private revelation about that.
Oh, I heard that. Well,
But
I don't know the science behind why that
Mhm.
conclusion, but the practicing of these baths all
Yeah,
over the region, all of this emerges after the Maccabean revolt.
that that's definitely right. Yeah. And this is a dramatic change. And you see it in the literature too. I mean, that's really the thesis of my book, is that now I would say maybe more strongly than Jonathan Adler that the Jewish law had been to a great degree formulated. I think at least the Pentateuch or the Torah was, and that there were priests who said you should follow this. But as far as we can tell, even the priests didn't follow it very much. What we know about the priests down to the time of the Maccabean revolt isn't very edifying, to say the least. And it does not give you the impression that these were people who were worrying about the purity of liquid streams, or the kind of thing that they worry about in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then you get the attempt of Antiochus Epiphanes to abolish the Jewish law. Now, this is a complicated issue. We can talk about it. We can have another session on it sometime if you
Yeah.
like. But what happened there, I think, is that he thought Judea was in revolt. He wanted to make changes in Judea. Some people resisted that. And then there was fighting between two parties in Jerusalem. So his way of putting down the revolt is to deny them the right to live according to their ancestral laws. Now, this was kind of standard practice in the ancient world, that if you conquer an area, you graciously let people live according to their own laws. But every now and then, a king might get mad at the people of a town or an area and withdraw that privilege. Now, we don't have many examples of that, but we have one or two. So that attempt to suppress the law, I think, backfired massively. And so you suddenly got people who were tripping over each other to show their zeal for the law and to show how they observed it in more detail than anybody else.
This is the birth, I think, through which we should see what we're going to deal with is Paul. So I want to mention, I've got notes, and maybe they'll help guide us. Maybe they'll derail us. I hope they don't. They're in the vein of this book, that your chapter specifically on Paul, on the invention of Judaism. Once again, get the book. If you haven't read it, you write so well, it's so clear, and it's fun. You start in Acts, and oh goodness, that really big moment. So first of all, non-Mosaic literature in Judaism. It's very important to understand that Judaism is not like one thing. And our problem often in the future where we're at, and I say future from their standpoint, is we have this picture of rabbinic Judaism, and we're trying to look back and imagine, oh, it's just this like unified thing. But we have to stop, I think, and I'm speaking for lay people. Scholars have already recognized this, but we have to stop projecting and think rabbinic Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, Hasidic Judaism, or something is our interpretive model by which we should understand Judaism. And if we go back historically, there's non-Mosaic literature within Jewish thought. Can you briefly tell us about that as we start to approach that first century context?
Well, before the Babylonian exile, there wasn't what you might call a fixation on Moses. No, this was a people that had various traditions. You had traditions about Abraham and the patriarchs, and you had some traditions about Moses too as part of the general mix. Now, around the time of the Babylonian exile, and possibly in part a little bit before it, there was an attempt to draft a law. Now, a law is maybe not quite the right word for it, but an official document, like of what it meant to be a Judean. And that's the book of Deuteronomy in large part. And it's Deuteronomy then that kind of grew into the whole Torah. Now, according to the book of Ezra, which is supposedly written about the middle of the 5th century BC, Ezra comes back from Babylon and he has this book of the law. But it doesn't actually seem to be exactly the same thing that we now have in the Pentateuch. And, he may have gotten everybody excited about it for a weekend, but then Ezra disappears, and you find that a couple of years later, people are back to paying no attention to it at all. Now, when I say paying no attention to it, I'm mainly concerned about the kind of laws that you would say are ethnic markers, the distinctive things. Now, religious festivals are a big thing. Sabbath is a big thing. Circumcision is a big thing. And certain purity practices, now there isn't much about those at all in the Persian period. So it's really only after this encounter with Antiochus Epiphanes in the time of the Maccabees that people get really serious about making this our statement of identity. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, came through the Hasmonean kings, and Jonathan Adler would agree with that. They weren't necessarily very pious themselves, but, they upheld the Jewish law as the standard for Judaism. You might make an analogy with the modern state of Israel, where a lot of the modern Israelis aren't especially religious, but, they give special place and special honor to the conservative side and to the traditional Judaism, because they want to identify with it, even if they're not interested in practicing it.
Interesting.
So, but now, so then I think after the Maccabean revolt, suddenly you have a Jewish party in power. And at least by about 100 BC, the Hasmoneans make themselves kings. Now, and they say, in effect, and of course you should observe the Torah. Now, you have some parties then who take that very seriously. And that's when we get the rise of sectarianism. And a lot of the sectarianism comes from people fighting over what's the correct interpretation of the law. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls are probably our best source on this, but I think this is also what's going on with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the kind of sectarian squabbles that you read about in the New Testament. And some of the time, this was very minute stuff. There's a famous document in the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4QMMT, some of the works of the law, which was apparently sent to a high priest, making the case, look at this and you'll see that we are right and the other guys are wrong. And many of us think, this was written by Essenes and the other guys were the Pharisees. Now, the kinds of things that we're fighting over is if you pour water from one glass into another and the second glass is dirty, does the impurity travel upstream so that the first glass is now impure as well? Now, maybe they were on to something, but that was something that would never have bothered me until I read it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But, this is the kind of thing that led these people to say, we just cannot live in contact with these other peoples. We've just got to set up our own way of life and keep away from them. Now, so you see, the Essenes were at one extreme of that. The Pharisees, were relatively liberal. But then Jesus comes along and he's way out on the other wing. So this is what
it's like today. It's almost like a repeat of politics today. So it's just in a different format. So just to emphasize and make the point, in the question was simply non-Mosaic literature. So we have like Enoch come in, and Enoch's like focused on this figure before Moses. You could even argue Paul, as we're tiptoeing into this, while he references he's highly Abraham, he loves Abraham, and it fits within what he's trying to do. So we're going to get to that. Just so our audience who may have never read, let's just say, E.P. Sanders or Paula Fredrickson or Matthew Thiessen or N.T. Wright or any of these people you've read, you've been acquainted with different works, can you lay out a brief description of the discussion of Paul and the various groups, briefly? What are the arguments about Paul within the scholarship on Pauline literature?
Okay, let me just back up a little bit because I got a little distracted when I was answering your last question.
Yes, sir.
But as to there being non-Mosaic literature, if you pick up an Old Testament now and you read through the book of Proverbs, you're not going to hear anything about Moses. You're not going to hear anything about Moses in the book of Job, in Ecclesiastes. Now, you may get a couple of things that remind you of other parts of the Old Testament, but there is no appeal to the authority of Moses. Now, this, I think, would have been typical of a lot of Judaism. You mentioned the Enoch literature. Well, now we don't know exactly who these people were, but there were people who thought that Enoch was your main mediator of revelation. And then, after the Maccabean revolt, they say, no, it's Moses. And you get this too in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that it all comes back to Mosaic, the Mosaic law. Now, then along comes Paul in the middle of the first century, and some of what Paul has to say about the law does not seem so nice at all. In fact, he seems to regard the law as possibly even an obstacle, or some people would read him that way. So freedom from the law became kind of the catchword. Now, this was the way Augustine read Paul, and most faithfully, it was the way Martin Luther read Paul. So that for Luther, the whole point of Christianity was to be free from the Jewish law. And he hung that on Paul. Now, I'd say this was probably the dominant interpretation of Paul, even 50 years ago, or a little more than 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And one of the reasons for that is that there are a lot of New Testament scholars in Germany who were Lutheran and who tended to gravitate to Paul. And this kind of thing happens. They were attracted to Paul. Now, I would say the first great protest against that was by Christer Stendahl, who was Swedish. He was, I could say one of my teachers at Harvard. He was dean of Harvard Divinity School when I was there. I didn't work closely with him in particular, but I knew him quite well. And Stendahl said, that your typical Lutheran parody of Paul is that Paul says that the law is a burden and nobody can keep it. And so Christ liberated us from it. And Stendahl says the law wasn't a burden. The law, gave people structure in life. The people who observed the law were having a great time. They loved it. And Paul himself wasn't struggling under the law and looking to be freed from it. He had, as Stendahl said, a robust conscience. And so he, part of what he was doing was saying we have a caricature of Judaism here. And you've got to appreciate that Judaism was not seen as a burdensome religion. Now, then in the 1970s, I guess 1977 to be exact, E.P. Sanders published his book on Paul and Palestinian Judaism. E.P. Sanders, by the way, just died a few months ago.
Yeah.
Sad to hear.
Hmm.
He was a man who had enormous influence on New Testament scholarship, and he was a good scholar. Now, on this question, Sanders said, you've got to think of Judaism not just as the law. And it's not the case that people are earning salvation by keeping the law. Think of it as a covenant. The law functions within a covenant. So you have to be already part of the covenant people to be concerned with the law at all. So that then, all right, your observance of the law affects your, whether you're a member in good standing, so to speak, but it's more like a matter of maintenance. And there is also a kind of grace in Judaism. God is merciful. You know, if you sin, you can be forgiven. So it's not all you break the law and you go to hell. Now, again, I think this had enormous influence. With all of this debate, very much in the background, is the Christian realization that something went horribly wrong in the Holocaust in World War II. And that Christians, have a lot on their conscience with regard to Jews.
Right.
We have not treated Jews well historically. Take the long view of history. Christianity has been pretty awful to Jews. And so I think a lot of this new perspective on Paul is a desire to atone for that, get away from it, and be appreciative of Judaism.
Mm.
So I think, Sanders was not himself a theologian, I would say. He was more a historian of religion. And now his conclusion was that, Paul didn't think there was something fundamentally wrong with Judaism. The only thing wrong with Judaism was that it was not Christianity. And some of his critics made fun of him for that and said that sounds like a trivial reason. I'm not so sure whether it was a trivial reason, but it wasn't a terribly good explanation, actually, of what was driving Paul. And because I think, when you read through the Pauline epistles, it becomes pretty clear that the law is not enough. Whatever else you say about it, there's something not quite right there.
Mm-hmm.
And the question then becomes, what is it?
That's
And
where,
that is.
and that's where you mentioned Paul. You mentioned New Perspective. You mentioned the Lutheran position, and then there is also Paul within Judaism, which goes so far to say Paul was so about Judaism and so about the law that he didn't want Gentiles. And I read this in Paul, the Pagan's Apostle by Paula Fredrickson. Love the book, by the way. I love learning from all of these people.
Yeah.
But it seemed to me a bit omniscient on her part to assume she knew Paul's writing almost antagonistic toward the law, the works of the law, to just kind of like dissuade his Gentiles from actually participating in it. So he's like, really, you can imagine Paul going to the Jews and going, listen, I love this thing. I love the works of the law, but the dirty works of the law, they will not get you salvation to the Gentile to try and dissuade him. And to me, it wasn't convincing, if that makes sense.
I know this is now, I would say, the extreme of the week. I wouldn't necessarily say that Paula is the most extreme of the group,
Right.
But this whole thing started with John Gager at Princeton and Lloyd Gaston up in Canada. And they wanted to argue that Paul said there are two ways to salvation. So, Gentiles have Christ. Jews just can keep the law. Now, I mean, that I think was well-intentioned, but you can't defend that, I think. You know, when you look at some of the things that Paul says, yeah, we are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. Now, as one of the critics of this new trend said, he does not say, and we know that a Gentile is justified not by works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. I think it's perfectly clear that Paul thinks everybody ultimately depends on Christ.
Is it fair, just jabbing into your Acts example at the beginning of your chapter in the Pauline part of the invention of Judaism, is it fair to say that this is in that vein of Acts 21, where you're like, we hear rumors that you're saying that like Jews, even Jews aren't supposed to keep the customs, supposed to keep the law. And we know Paul never speaks, by the way. It's interesting. The author wants to like, but we know, Paul, that you would not do that. And he takes this vow with four others. But do you think that plays into this issue?
Well, yeah, perhaps. I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it that way. But now, you know, there are a couple of other people then who went farther than Gager and Gaston. And Matthew Thiessen, whom you mentioned, I think, would be a prime example of this. And supported enthusiastically by Christine Hayes, who's here at jail. And Thiessen's argument was that it was such a privilege to keep the law that Gentiles weren't worthy of that. Now, and you know, Magnus Zetterholm, who is another member of that club, brings up a midrash from a few hundred years later about like Israel being married to the law, and you can't just give the law to anybody else. It would be like prostituting your wife.
Right.
Now, I don't think there is anything in the Pauline corpus that is even compatible with that. You see, all of that, you have to assume that Paul isn't saying what he means. In fact, that he is deliberately not saying what he means because he doesn't want the law to be attractive.
Right. This is the same argument as saying he only believes you can become a Jew unless you were circumcised on the 8th day. Other than that, you're screwed. You can't become one. Like you point out, like, can he not just say that?
Yeah, sure he could have said that. But, you know, I don't know that this wasn't this was only a big issue in a book like the Book of Jubilees. You know, after the Maccabean revolt, you have a couple of books like Jubilees and the Temple Scroll that show this new obsession with the details of the law. Let's say. Now, that to my mind is just the other end of the spectrum from Paul. And, you know, Paul isn't like them in any respect. Now, one of the things is they are not interested in the salvation of Gentiles. No, Jubilees, so Jubilees, the only good Gentile is a dead Gentile. It's you know, they want to separate from the Gentiles completely. So to say that Paul has that mentality is sheer nonsense.
Wow. So there, you say, okay, so there is so much good stuff here. And by the way, you're literally tacking off much of the notes that I had in terms of this. So I'm like, okay, erase that so I don't come across it. Cause I was going to ask, like, I had one, Matthew Thiessen, Christine Hayes, go too far on Paul? Yes, of course. Let me erase that one. So that was a question I had on, you know, as I dive into this. This is a good one. I think this is a good one. You right there in that previous thing also you kind of said two-way justification. No, that you're not like that doesn't fit Paul in your estimation. How does N.T. Wright get Paul wrong? How is N.T. Wright wrong on Paul with his apocalypticism? Right. I know you remember the article you sent me on. Have you ever published that article on Mark? Because I wanted to share that, and everyone's like, "Let me read it."
It hasn't been published. This
Okay.
was at a conference in Moscow in 2019. It may yet be published. I don't know. It's out of my hands, so to speak.
Right.
But I think, I think, I mean, Tom Wright obviously has an exceptional talent for what we may call, and not meaning anything derogatory by it, popularizing.
Mm-hmm.
But he communicates, he reaches a lot of people. And in order to do that, he oversimplifies. Now, that in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can lead to distortion. And I think, this is what happens with with the whole apocalyptic imagery of the end of the world. Wright is inclined to say, oh, they didn't really mean that. That's just kind of like hyperbole.
Right.
And now on Paul, you see, again, I think it's partly that mentality. Because, okay, there are two things you need to keep in mind about Paul. First of all, he's a diaspora Jew. Now, we have a fair body of literature written in Greek by Jews in this period. One of the trademarks of that period is that they typically, they may talk about the law and they may attach great importance to the law, but they never or seldom talk about things like circumcision and a Sabbath and purity laws and kashrut and all of those things that are of central importance in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Even though, the Greek literature will also cite Leviticus, but typically what the Greek literature tries to do is find the deep moral principles, love of God and love of your neighbor, if you like. And so somebody like Philo. Now, Philo also works through all the laws in great detail, but he does so to show that they all have a spiritual significance. So if we don't eat a certain kind of bird, it isn't because we have anything against this particular kind of bird. It's because we look on them as symbols of greed or hostility or something. So that's like the vein in which most of this Greek literature is written.
If I may just to poke into this point, I thought it was Enoch, somewhere in Enochian literature that I was reading, but you would know right off the bat, where they interpret things like it is said, don't eat pig. But really, the reason you don't eat pig is that pigs eat anything and they have no filter about what they eat. Or don't eat this bird, like you said, because birds are thieves. You don't want to be like a bird. You don't want to be like what you eat. Because the bird swoops down and steals the food of the hard-earned work of some other animal. And so don't be this thief. Or, they analogize it.
I don't recall anything like that in the Enoch literature. You get things like that in the letter of Aristeas.
Okay.
Which is a letter supposedly written by one Greek to another about the Jewish law and what a wonderful thing it is. And somebody explains to him, that it's not, we're not superstitious, we're not concerned about pigs as such. It's that, it's what they symbolize. So that's the world that Paul is coming from. And I think that has a bearing on why he is not especially interested in the great minutiae of the law. It shapes his mentality. At the same time, he is not only a diaspora Jew. The great turning point for Paul is when he comes to believe that Jesus of Nazareth is risen from the dead and is exalted to heaven. And now this I would call an apocalyptic idea, because the resurrection of the dead was very much an apocalyptic idea. He was not saying that Jesus' soul is immortal and it's up in heaven somewhere. He was saying that Jesus died and rose, so that which died came back. Now, this is an apocalyptic idea. It was, a novelty in Judaism in the time of the Maccabees. Not everybody subscribed to it. Some people did. Now, believing that gives him a whole new perspective. Because where somebody like Philo would say, that the way to salvation, if we may use that term, is to keep the law, but keep it with the proper understanding. Now, Paul would say, no, it isn't. Keeping the law, even no matter how well you understand it, is not enough. You need something more. There is a new revelation, and this new revelation comes with the resurrection and the exaltation of Jesus.
Okay,
And
I'm sorry, I'm a poke in when you get me excited here. This is an interesting thing. So we can't prove, right? There's a lot here that's up in the air to understand, to try and grasp, because we're trying to put our finger on Paul. I titled this Understanding the Apostle Paul. That's what I titled this video. And we're trying to get to what was meant, what was going on. Why would he say this? Why is this? And one of the things Paul claims in his own letters, or it seems he claims, is that he was a Pharisee. Now, I've heard some people actually try to say he wasn't a Pharisee, but that he, kept the law like a Pharisee, that he was a strict Jew in some way. He equates himself to Pharisee, whether he was one or wasn't, doesn't matter. The point is they're very strict compared to, here we are with that spectrum again, right? You've got the Qumran that seem to be like the germ or the defilement will crawl upstream through the water if you pour it out, to the other side that's like, get your donkey on the Sabbath and get it out of the trench. What are you talking about? So various spectrum here. And if he was more on a strict side, and then he's coming over to this Jesus side, that's more, or the Christ movement, that's more liberal. Let's use the term liberal to mean more relaxed on the law. Wouldn't this make sense if we were interpreting Paul through what you're describing here? He was strict. Now he's more relaxed, but he has some new thing too, a new revelation. Is that common, or is that known in Jewish thought, that there's a superseding of revelation that can kind of usurp, or I don't know if that's a proper term, but it has more power over the previous thing?
Yeah. Now, it is certainly known. And I would say you have two major examples of it before the time of Paul. One of them was Enoch. Now, there's been a big debate about this, was Enochic Judaism opposed to Mosaic Judaism? And I think probably not. But I think the people who liked Enoch said, oh yeah, Moses is fine. Moses, as Paul would say, is holy and just and good. But, you need more than that. You need revelations about the heavens. You need visions about the Son of Man sitting on his throne of glory. And it's those additional revelations, that make the difference. Also, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, without any doubt, venerated Moses and thought that the Mosaic law was of central importance. But they also thought that they had a special revelation of how the Mosaic law should be interpreted. And they say this quite explicitly in the Damascus document, that, God paid attention to this segment of penitence and revealed to them the things in which all Israel had erred. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they talk about two kinds of laws: those that are revealed to everybody, and then those that are hidden to most people. And the people in the Dead Sea Scrolls figured they had that which was hidden. Now, in the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, what's hidden, the extra revelation, is the proper interpretation of the law, but it's still very much about the law. Whereas in the Enoch literature and in Paul, it isn't really so much about the law. It's something else. And it isn't necessarily really opposed to the law, but it's independent of the law and more important. There's another example, actually. There's a book called Fourth Ezra. Have you ever read Fourth Ezra?
Oh yeah. It's really quite a plea for help and a cry.
It's a great book.
Yeah.
It's a great book. You know, if the canon were really inspired, Fourth Ezra would be in it. And I could tell you a few books that shouldn't be, but we'll leave that. But in Fourth Ezra, at the end of the book, Ezra is inspired to restore the law because it has been burnt. But actually, the angel dictates to him a total of what, 70 books, or yeah. So, you know, there are those that are to be made, 94 books altogether, because there are those that are to be made known to everybody, so that the pure and the impure can all read them. And then there are the other 70 that are to be kept secret. And those presumably are books like Fourth Ezra itself, or maybe the Enoch books. But it says, for it is in those that you have the secret of wisdom and the fount of understanding. That's the good stuff. So, you know, in that regard, again, Paul fits a pattern. Now, you can have two people who each think you need a higher revelation, but can disagree vehemently as to what that higher revelation is. So it doesn't resolve the oppositions that way.
Mm-hmm.
But the pattern is there.
With the Melchizedek scroll, which, by the way, I was in the cave they found that in when I was down there. Would that Melchizedek scroll kind of fit that kind of mysterious secret information in a way?
Yeah, I think it would. I think there's a lot of stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls, actually, that would fit that.
Okay, so two things real quick. I need to, I do want to share, let me stop screen here real quick. Just for earlier, I didn't get a chance to actually share this with you pertaining to the Qumran, what I was talking about with them having worms. There's a few archaeologists that told us at Qumran, the Essenes and the scrolls. So if anybody's, I could try to send this to them. So this is work that was based, when I mentioned I went on a tour actually with Dr. James Tabor. It was wonderful. We learned a lot of great things. It was good to see some of the caves. And but just to kind of vindicate what was being said there, I have an article. I could try to find a way to send it to people via email if you really want to know more on why they're saying when they found the latrines and the camp was like northwest or something like that. Anyway, I'm ignorant. Don't take my word on it, but there is information on this if you're interested, and I couldn't get it out of my head. Anyway, back to Paul. And this is an important thing. Paul says the law of Christ.
He does.
What is the law of? Yeah, what is that?
Well, you know, it's related to the question of what does he mean by faith in Jesus Christ? Now, you know, when you read through, say, his correspondence with the Corinthians, it's quite clear that Paul was not an antinomian.
Right.
You know, Paul wasn't saying you shouldn't have any law at all. Paul, in fact, has very strict ideas of what they should be doing and is outraged at some of the things that they are actually doing.
Right.
And then, you know, what he expects them to do, by and large, conforms pretty well to the Mosaic law, except that he doesn't pay so much attention to the ritual aspects. He doesn't think that those are important for the Gentiles. Now, so then what the part of the law that is still valid, I would think that probably counts as the law of Christ. But I think there's probably something that gives it its cohesion. Now, you see, one of the oddities of Paul is he does not quote the Gospels. You know, he doesn't quote the sayings of Jesus very much. Every now and then he'll have a word of the Lord, but not very much. But he does, I think, have some idea of, what Christ was about. And a nice example of it is in chapter 2 of Philippians, where he says, "Let this mind be in you that was also in Christ Jesus." How, even though he was Son of God, he emptied himself and took the form of a slave. And therefore God exalted him. Now, I think that's what he means by the law of Christ. That's what he means by the way you should live.
Right.
And he doesn't base his view of the way you should live on inherited sayings of Jesus or parables or anything like that, although they may all be compatible with it. He really extrapolates it from the fact that Jesus was crucified. It's somebody, who didn't look out for himself, who gave himself up. And now, you could make a case that that's not a bad interpretation of what Jesus of Nazareth was about. But I think that's more or less the idea of what he means. And then I think when he talks about faith in Jesus Christ, and some people now would argue that should really be trust in Jesus Christ. It presupposes, I think, that you believe that he was raised from the dead. But the important thing is that, you trust in that. You commit yourself to it. Or, as he puts it in Philippians, let this mind be in you that he had. It's really imitation of Christ.
Right.
It's live like Christ. That's what he's saying. Now, again, at the risk of oversimplification here, it seems to me that Paul's essential revelation is that Jesus was raised and taken up to heaven. In other words, he got there.
Right.
Now, you have no record. You could make a case for Moses maybe, but you did not have at least a recent record of somebody who was raised from the dead and taken up to heaven because he was keeping the law. Therefore, I think Paul thought, the law isn't getting it done. And it's not that there's something bad about it. It doesn't get you where you need to go. And the fact that Jesus was raised, and, I assume that Paul did have a vision. Maybe he hit his head when he fell off his horse, who knows? But I think he did have this vision, and he did believe that Jesus was now alive and up in heaven. And therefore, if that's what you want, if that's what you want to get there, your best advice is try to be like Jesus.
This is a wonderful, I've got a few more questions from me. And then if you don't mind, we've got some questions from our audience that are wonderful. Okay. And one of those is, I recently had Dennis R. McDonald over. He has quite interesting thoughts. And he's talking about Q. And he told a story. We recorded his story, so I'm giving snippets away. But he pretty much says he came to find, when he goes back to Q in his research, that Jesus was killed in the Q document because of his view on law. And I asked him, like, is that something that happens? And he says, well, if you take Josephus, what happens to James, and you see how these very strict particular parties were versus those who weren't, you do find accounts that seem to suggest that it was other Jews conspiring against other Jews because they didn't like them because of their views on the law. Do you think, it's speculation, I get it, but you talk about have this mind which was also in Christ, Jesus, right? Yeah. Paul says these things. And is it possible that where do you fall on this, connecting dots back to this behind the curtain we call Jesus, because it's hard to get there, that he himself was in that vein and was actually, I know post-Holocaust, we don't like to get this way and point out, but it's not like there's an anti-Semitic slant. This is in-group fighting going on. So we have to understand these are Jews against Jews. in debate. Do you
Well,
think this goes back to Jesus?
I'm not quite prepared to pronounce on Q.
Oh,
I
so
haven't thought very much about it really, and I'll leave that one open as to what explanation you might have in Q. But in all the Gospels, as we have them, Jesus is executed by the Romans. This makes perfectly good sense. You have somebody who comes along with an excited crowd of followers who start shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David," and other inflammatory things as he's coming into Jerusalem. And the Romans say, "We got to tamp this down, cut this
right.
off." Now, we have several parallels for that in Josephus, of more or less prophetic figures who gathered a crowd of followers. One of them went up on the Mount of Olives and promised that the walls would fall down, this kind of thing. Another one went to the Jordan and promised that the waters would part before him. And of course, those things didn't happen. But the Romans, didn't laugh those people off as crazy. They killed first and laughed afterwards. So, they were taking no chances on any of that.
Right.
So I would think it's overwhelmingly probable that that's why Jesus was killed.
Then last
Now,
question.
the big question, though, behind
Okay.
that is, were the Jewish leaders complicit in handing him over?
Right.
Now, there is a very interesting passage in the Gospel of John where the high priest says, "It is expedient that one man should die for the people." And what he means is, if we let him go on, the Romans will come and destroy the whole city, which, of course, they eventually did. And so I think that this also happened later on at the time of the war against Rome, that people, were some of the people in authority were more inclined to hand over the rebels than to support them. And that's because they made a perfectly good judgment, I think, that this thing was going to end in disaster. So I think that's what I would say was going on. Now, could the high priest also have been annoyed at Jesus not having proper respect for the law? Quite possibly. And so it could play into it that way. But I don't think it's the primary reason. But no, I don't know actually what Dennis's argument is with regard to Q. So
Right. Sorry, that was probably unnecessary to even mention. I was just leading up to it. Two things: Jason Staples' work on Israel. Do you have a few sentences you could tell us that maybe you agree or critically? Because I know he takes some jabs at your work in his idea of Israel in his Old Testament eschatological view. He thinks they're still holding on to this idea, like unanimously across the board, that Israel, the northern kingdom, in some way, there's like an eschatological fulfillment of all Israel. Anyway, what are your thoughts of his work and in Paul?
I've been in a Zoom meeting with Jason. He's quite impressive. After that, I went and got a PDF of his book, and it's sitting on my desktop, but I still haven't read it.
Maybe we'll do a follow-up and talk about that. And then
but I need to read it first.
Right. That's what I'm hoping to hear your thoughts on that. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Last one is we talk about, you're the man on apocalypticism. I mean, I always refer people to your works. If they want to know what apocalypticism, eschatology, they really Jewish thought on this, they need to check you out. So you don't have to break down the argument because I know it'd take a while. Do you think Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet? And that meaning he predicted things and they fell. And obvious Paul, I know you think that Paul definitely expected history to meet its end soon, and that didn't happen.
Yeah.
So do you think Jesus was?
That's the $64 million question in the New Testament. And the problem is, Jesus didn't write anything.
Right.
This was his big mistake. Either that, or it was a stroke of genius. And it's what made him really fascinating to everybody ever since. Because you're never sure whether what you're reading is what Jesus thought or something that we're saying about him after he died?
Right.
So, that's a difficult question. So, for example, I would say that when you read in the Gospels about the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, if you're assuming that the Son of Man is Jesus, that's got to be after his death. Otherwise, why would he be up on the clouds of heaven? He was there on earth. Did Jesus himself talk about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and do so without making clear who this was? It's entirely possible. But I think, the fact that the early Christian tradition is so heavily apocalyptic makes it, it's hard to believe that they got him completely wrong, that there wasn't some basis for that in his teaching.
I like the way you said that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the final one I had was sibling oracles pertaining to the book of Revelation. Revelation seems, and I mean the book Revelation,
Yeah.
Island of Patmos, John,
Yeah.
seems to be engaging, is aware of the sibling oracles' work, at least in some respects. With it
Yeah.
may be a common source of Nero Redivivus and things like that,
Yeah.
but it also seems to be anti-Pauline in some ways. It seems to take jabs at Paul in some ways. What are your thoughts about this book as it relates to Paul and the sibling oracles?
Oh, you mean that Revelation, you think, takes jabs at Paul?
Right. I think
Yeah.
at Revelation 2 or 3, I think it is, when they're
No,
talking about church.
I would think that just doesn't pay that much attention to Paul one way or the other. I mean,
Okay.
it's not, it's Revelation, if you like, is much more apocalyptic than Paul was, because they think they're living at a point further along in the timeline. And so that now everything is urgent to a greater degree than it was in Paul. That's maybe for another day.
Yeah.
And maybe for somebody who is more immersed in the book of Revelation.
Yeah, I was going to mention the sibling, but your wonderful wife wrote a good book too on the combat myths. So I hope people will read that. Okay, question and answer. Constellation Pegasus says, how much science was Paul taught? Did Paul have knowledge of the zodiac? These later Greek authors seem to have put some zodiac knowledge in their writings. Was the zodiac considered established science then, or pseudoscience?
I have, I don't know of any evidence pertinent to that. Now, so, I'm not saying that it wasn't, that he didn't have knowledge of the zodiac. I don't know of anything in the Pauline writings that shows that he did. And I don't know of anything that would make me think that he thought it was important.
Thank you so much.
I'm sure you'd find some Greek writers who did, but
Right. Mark de Velden, thank you for the super chat, Mark. Paul's sincerity to mission. Is there evidence that Paul accumulate personal wealth or just expenses?
I'm pretty sure he didn't accumulate personal wealth. I think he probably just about made it living off the support of his communities wherever he went. But, he wasn't about to buy himself a villa in the Mediterranean and retire.
Yeah, I've
So
heard some people say his.
I'd be pretty confident of that he didn't make money out of it. I'd say
Arends,
no interest. Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Aaron says, just tuning in, do you think that Paul was inspired by Isaiah 53, for example, during his trip to Arabia, Galatians?
Again, I don't see the evidence. I mean, why would you think he was? Now, I mean, he may have been inspired to some degree by Isaiah 53. If you take that passage in Philippians that I talked about, that it's a common pattern, which you also get in Isaiah 53, of that the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, you can have that without getting it from Isaiah 53. I think many people would have read Isaiah 53 that way, not necessarily as a prophecy, but just for the pattern of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Constellation Pegasus, secret knowledge the Dead Sea Scrolls say? That's bizarre.
Oh, no. No. I mean, it's all the word razzmatazz, if you like, but raz, which is a Persian loanword for mystery. And so, yeah, that they absolutely believed they had secret knowledge. And they also, in fact, sometimes saying you shouldn't tell this to outsiders. You guard your secret knowledge. But that's all fairly explicit. In fact, you can look up, there's a good book on mystery in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
It makes me want to ask, do you think, because he talks about mysteries that were unknown in ages past, but
I think, again, this would have been common enough in the culture. You don't have to get it from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
is it possible, just throwing it out there to you to get your thoughts, that he got this from the pagan mystery religions that were around as well? Because he's engaging Gentiles.
And of course, people have often thought that he did. But I think, the whole idea of mystery, this would have been, if we may talk about a zeitgeist, something that's kind of in the culture, in the Eid. People use a lot of Freudian terminology without actually knowing anything about Freud. But some things kind of get in the air, and mysterion would have been one of them.
Thank you so much for that. Melody Joy. Revelation sounds anti-Paul. Would you consider the Gospels to be anti-Paul too? Mark 13, 21 through 22. Thank you, gentlemen. I could pull up Mark 13 if you want.
I wouldn't necessarily think that they're anti-Paul. I think that by and large, they go at things a little differently. For one thing, all the Gospels are much more focused on the life and teaching of Jesus. And, the only thing that interested Paul about Jesus was that he died and was raised again. That actually is a little bit like Revelation. So I wouldn't see either Revelation nor the Gospels as anti-Paul.
I'm curious to know if you think Mark is Paula Fredrickson tried to argue that she didn't think that Mark and Paul, he knows Mark, or sorry, he knows Paul. But do you think that Mark knows Paul? I mean, your wife wrote the wonderful commentary, of course. So.
You'd have to ask her, I'm afraid. I couldn't comment on Mark here.
Right? Vesper says, Mr. Collins,
Paul being Simon Vegas? Definitely not.
Yeah, I've heard a scholar actually say that.
Hey, whenever anybody comes up with a highly specific identification like that, you can safely discount it.
Thank you so much, Vesper. Minder Bender, what do you think about the historical criteria many historians use to determine if a saying or teaching goes back to Jesus? Multiple attestation, dissimilarity. Does it work? Thanks.
They work to a certain degree. And the problem is that they don't work the same way for everybody. Now, there was a movement maybe 20, 30 years ago now, on the historical Jesus, the Jesus seminar, which actually had people vote on plausibility of sayings, and that came in for a lot of ridicule. But I think, in principle, I think they make sense. The dissimilarity is the most controversial of them. And I think, it works to a limited degree. I'm just working, actually, today I'm writing an article for a Festschrift, and it's on Jesus and divorce. Now, you have the Gospel of Mark says, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another is anathema, in effect. And then Matthew says, except in the case of unchastity. So which of them was right? Well, I think in that case, you can be very confident that Mark was right. Because, everybody in ancient Judaism thought it was okay to divorce your wife if she was unfaithful. So when somebody comes along and says, no, it's not okay at all, I think that's a strong personality. Now, that may not quite be proof that it was Jesus, but I think it makes it more likely if you assume that, the reason we have so much interest in Jesus is he was a strong personality. He was an original personality. And so that which comes across as boldly original is indeed more likely, I think, to go back to him. But that doesn't mean, that he couldn't also have said things that agreed with what everybody else said. So in the end of the day, you're never quite sure.
I actually had John Kloppenborg respond. I asked him this question: give me 3 dissimilarity arguments of embarrassment, or almost things that you could tell the later gospels are like, oh snap, Jesus. So they had to fix it. And it's what you're saying. There's certain things he said that it's like, let the dead bury the dead. What? It is a Jewish ritual to bury the dead. What do you mean? If you say something like that, you're hardcore to use my modern term.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I think we caught up. We caught up on everything. I just want to simply round off this discussion on Paul. Give us a kind of a synopsis overview of what you think's going on with Paul in our episode today, if you don't mind.
Well, I suppose a lot of the current debate is about the Paul within Judaism. And I think all of that discussion is right insofar as, Paul was a Jew. His whole understanding of the world was within Judaism. It's an interesting book by Joshua Garraway, in which he claims, he talks about Paul's Jewish Gentiles. Now, of course, Paul never actually says that Gentiles should become Jews. But what he does say is that they get grafted into Israel. And this is why Jason Staples may be of interest here, because, in a way, Paul takes Israel rather than Judaism. And it seems even that, he associates Judaism with the dependence on the Mosaic law and on a certain style of interpreting it. And he wants to go beyond that. But he doesn't just say good human beings. They're still going to be children of Abraham. So it's still within a biblical framework, within the framework of a chosen people, so to speak, greater Israel, if you like. That's what's going on.
You remind me of Cattell Berthelot's work, Jews and the Roman Rivals. And that's a great work where she shows how even the Jews didn't agree on this. And one rabbi would make a saying and say, nope, you cannot say Deuteronomy, what was it? Deuteronomy 30. I can't remember the specific, where it's like 26, I think it is, where he's like, Abraham is our father. And he says, no, you can say Abraham is your father. But then another rabbi comes on and goes, what are you talking about? Have you not read the scriptures? It says that he will be the father of many goyim. And like the way they interpreted goyim rather than, just nations. Yeah. Wow. So there's a lot to study on Paul. Any recommended books? You mentioned one there that we should probably dive into about Pauline studies.
Yes, that one by Joshua Garraway is one. Now, I refer to a couple of other things. I probably have to go back now. There's a good one by a man named Frank Thiemann, whom I don't know at all. And it's not a new book. It's been out a while. Paula Fredrickson, of course, is always tremendously engaging. Whether you end up agreeing with her or not, she's a good read and very much worthwhile. I think the attempt to make Paul into a really orthodox Jew goes way over the top. Paul was not a zealot for the law, that much at least you can be sure of. But on the other hand, I think, people are quite right to say that you have to understand him as a Jew. Daniel Boyarin, a radical Jew. True of Daniel as well as of Paul. But yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much for your time. I do want people to go get your book. It's always an interesting talk with you. I learned so much, and I always consider ideas that I haven't heard. And you know what I find fascinating about you, Dr. Collins, that I guess I said this to Paula Fredrickson once, that a lot of times people are like, I can't wait for this guild of scholarship to pass away and move on, because where there's death, there's hope, she said. And meaning we can't get into a new paradigm or really get into new stuff because so many people of the older paradigm aren't willing to shift or even continue their growth of learning. You, on the other hand, have been one of these people that I've noticed is still like, I almost imagine till you're in the grave, you're going to be constantly shifting and like growing in your thinking on these things. And whether you're right or wrong on all of this stuff or some of this stuff, you're still trying to get there. And I think that's the takeaway.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Derek. Thank you. Keep
yes,
up the
sir.
good work.
Thank you. Let's do this again soon.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, what did you think of that show? I am always impressed listening and learning from Dr. John J. Collins. He has so many works that I've been studying. And, if you, on the internet side of things, many of you are engaging Christian apologists. And, if you take the scholarship, which hopefully you do it for more than just one reason as an anti-polemical work, but, Paul was wrong. So for your fundamentalists that want to come and jab at you, Dr. Collins' work so eloquently yep, he was wrong. And you're like, okay, don't you see the implications? And to him, and the scholars are in the ivory towers. I call them ivory towers because it's really very, very high concentrated information. This is a given. They know this. I mean, very few people like N.T. Wright want to come on and try to pretend, well, it happened, but it didn't happen the way that you think it happened. And it's like, it's so impressive to see the scholars in the field just recognize things that when we're out here engaging Christian apologists and fundamentalists, these people don't. These people are pushing that it's still in our future. It's still about to happen. And you're going, and these are people, obviously, that vote, that have a say in society and are living in a world in their head. I know because I was one, that it's kind of scary if you were there. So I hope that the works that you see from the scholars that I bring on MythVision will help change the general populace. In fact, that's why we have courses now, making it affordable for a general public to be able to take a course with really good scholarship and yet get this out to a general public. And it helps the scholar too. So they make money from this as well. I hope people get excited and enthusiastic about this work. And I hope you walked away from what you heard today from Dr. John J. Collins wanting to know more, wanting to learn this stuff more, because I've told people I'm a skeptic. I'm no longer a Christian, but I do try to keep the conversation going across the aisle. And I hope that you will too, because there's nothing to be afraid of. Like nobody owns a monopoly on reading, researching, and interpretation pertaining to these ancient texts. They're just as much yours as mine or anyone else. So I hope that you will journey with me, diving deeper into this. Get Dr. Collins' books. Again, I can't tell you how fascinating his work is if you haven't read it. Please join us. Go in the description, get some of his works, join our Patreon, help support us in any way you can. And even if that's a like, you can't afford a book, hit the like button. There's public articles he's written that are free. I don't know what to say. I'm excited. And I hope you are too. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day. And never forget, we are MythVision.